So let's start. A very warm welcome to all of you, to all the friends of the Landguet Ried and the RIPA International Center. My name is Begoña. I'm the director of Landguet Ried and hosting this meeting. So for those who don't know us, I would like to just introduce a little bit ourselves. We are a center, a land center based in near Bern in Switzerland. We organize programs that help translate Buddhist values and philosophy for a lay audience, and also host groups who share our vision and philosophy. And Landguet Ried is also the international seat of the RIPA International Center, which is a Vajrayana Buddhist center of the Nyingma school under the spiritual guidance of Yetru Jigme Rinpoche. So very warm welcome to all of you, and a very warm welcome to my friend Richie. So an introduction of Richie. He doesn't need so much of an introduction, but I will do one. He is the William James and Villas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and the director of the Weizmann Laboratory of Brain Imaging and Behavior. And he's also the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds, where he leads groundbreaking research on the training and the cultivation of well-being. He's best known for his groundbreaking work studying emotion and the brain, and he was one of the pioneers of the research of the effects of meditation on the brain as part of the work that was initiated in the 1990s by Mind and Life Institute. He's also a very close friend and confidant of the Dalai Lama, and he's a highly sought after speaker, an expert, and he leads conversations on the international stages such as the World Economic Forum, where I had the utter pleasure of meeting him, and from that time we became really good friends and collaborators. So we worked together on creating content and sessions around meditation and well-being alongside other renowned speakers and experts such as John Kabat-Zinn or Mathieu Ricard. And he has also visited Landguet Ried. He was here in 2018 for a one-day workshop on mindfulness in education, healthcare, and business. And he has published hundreds of scientific papers. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, or Altered Traits, also co-authored with Dan Goleman. And he has written more than 400 articles and papers throughout his academic life. So above all, he's a dear friend, and we are very, very happy to have him here again. He makes us the honor to speak with us for Landguet Ried, and I'm very, very grateful for that. I would just like to give a few hints on the logistics of the meeting. So maybe I will just share this with you. So make sure that your mic is mute during the whole meeting, so that we don't have noise interferences. And it's nice to see your faces, so we encourage to leave the video on. We have simultaneous interpretation during the meeting into French, Spanish, and German. So if you need interpretation, you need to click on the interpretation tab and select your language. And there will be a time for questions and answers at the end of Richie's talk. So you need to go, if you want to ask a question in English, you need to go to reactions button and raise your hand. And I will maybe give some more explanations about that when it's needed. So without much further ado, I would like to invite Richie. So we are going to spotlight you.
Thank you so much, Begoña. And it really is a delight and an honor to be here today. I'm really appreciative of this, and especially appreciative for all the work that you are doing, Begoña. And I very much have the aspiration that all of you learn more about the amazing programs that Begoña and her colleagues are doing. And it really is such a great service to humanity to see these programs disseminating widely. I am a neuroscientist and a psychologist by training. And today I'd like to share a little bit of my journey with you. And the plan is to speak for about half the time. I think we have a total of an hour and a half. And then the rest of the time we can engage in questions and answers and maybe even do a little bit of practice together. I began my career with a simple question, which still is a very important one to us. And the question is, why is it that some people are more vulnerable to life's challenges and other people more resilient? And how can we nurture qualities which can promote increased resilience and other ways of flourishing? In the early part of my career, I focused a lot on the adversity side of the equation. I studied the brain mechanisms that were important for vulnerability to depression and to anxiety and to stress. And then in 1992, I met His Holiness the Dalai Lama for the first time. And that was a pivotal encounter for me, because on that day in 1992, he challenged me in a very innocent way and asked, why is it that we have not used the tools of modern neuroscience that we've been using to study depression and anxiety and stress and fear? Why can't we use those same tools to study kindness and to study compassion? And that was a wake-up call for me to pivot more toward the positive side of our lives. When I was a student, we were very concerned with pathology, and we were taught to look at people and to try to figure out what's wrong with them. And what I find myself doing these days is looking at people and trying to find out what's right with them. It's a very different and important orientation. So I'd like to share my screen, and I'm going to show you a few slides to orient us. Whoops, I can't share. I wonder if the host can enable screen sharing for me.
It is done.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, can you all see that? Yes, okay. So this title is really the message that well-being actually is best regarded as a skill. And it doesn't mean that if you don't have high levels of well-being, it's somehow because you have failed to cultivate this skill. It doesn't mean that at all. We know that there are major factors in our culture, such as income inequality, racial injustice, all of which play a very important role in undermining our well-being. And those factors are important and exert influence. But what we do know is that everyone has a range in which she or he can reside in terms of their well-being, and it's possible for everyone to show improvements in their well-being, to nurture qualities which can help them navigate their daily lives with greater flourishing. And the neuroscience and psychological science evidence is quite compelling now in showing that well-being is best regarded as a skill. And this is a message which we think is an urgent public health need. Many of the problems that we have in our culture today, we can trace to, at least in part, being associated with a failure to cultivate well-being. So I want to begin with an inspirational photo. This is a picture of the Dalai Lama visiting our lab in Madison, Wisconsin, in the USA. This was taken in 2001, where we were showing him how brain imaging works and illustrating the MRI scanner and how it can be used to study the structure and the function of the human brain. This is one of 16 times the Dalai Lama has been to Madison, Wisconsin during the time he's been in exile. We're very blessed having him as a frequent visitor. And he has been the major inspiration for this work. He helped inaugurate our center in 2010 during another visit, which marked the beginning of the Center for Healthy Minds. So I want to begin by sharing with you some really important insights from modern science that have provided a foundation for all this work that we and many other scientists are engaged in. It's very important to appreciate that our work and the work of other scientists didn't simply come out of nowhere, but rather it was built on an important foundation in modern science. And were it not for this foundation, we could never have made the progress that we've made. Even though the progress that we've made is honestly quite small, but nevertheless, we couldn't have even made this progress without this prior work. And when I first began my career in the mid-1970s, I was convinced of the importance of meditation and tried to do research in this area, but it wasn't possible because these other developments had not yet occurred in modern science. So what are these developments? The first is neuroplasticity. I'm sure all of you have heard this word. It is a word that refers to the fact that our brains change in response to experience. And our brains are constantly being shaped, wittingly or unwittingly, consciously or not consciously, intentionally or unintentionally. Most of the time, our brains are being shaped unwittingly, unintentionally, by forces around us, over which we have little control, and of which we're typically only dimly aware. And here's the amazing fact. Scientists have shown that when we nurture healthy habits of mind using contemplative methods, our brains actually change. Now it's a simple fact, but it's a kind of amazing and astounding fact. It didn't need to happen this way. But this is a very key insight which gives us a handle, a mechanism. It gives us something to sink our teeth into, and has really been so important in enabling this work to go forward. When I first began my career, we were taught that the brain is different than any other organ in the body. We know that if you injure your skin, it will heal. It will heal because new cells are formed. We were taught that the brain is different. Doesn't do that. We now know that that was dogma. That's simply false. And this is not fringe science. What I'm talking about here is hard-nosed mainstream science, which clearly shows that neuroplasticity happens. And in the specific case that I'm alluding to here, we know that we actually grow new brain cells every day. The average person grows about 10,000 new brain cells every day. So what are some other themes that have been important? There's a theme that is the equivalent of neuroplasticity in the realm of genomics. And this is what we call epigenetics. Epigenetics is the science of how our genes are regulated. We all have a sequence of base pairs which constitute our DNA. And for the most part, that will not change over the course of a person's life. But what will change is the extent to which a gene is turned on or turned off. You can think of genes having little volume controls that go from low to high. And we know that our environment, our demeanor, our emotions, all influence our epigenetics. To give one example, we know that the way a mother behaves toward her offspring can induce epigenetic changes in the offspring. And recent evidence indicates that these epigenetic changes can not only persist for a long period of time, in certain cases, the entire life of an individual, but they can be transmitted for at least 1 or 2 generations. Some of you have probably heard of the intergenerational transmission of trauma, which in part is caused by or mediated by epigenetic mechanisms. I'd like to invite you to consider the possibility of the epigenetic transmission of awakening. If there is the intergenerational transmission of trauma, there is also the possibility of the intergenerational transmission of awakening through the same mechanisms. So one of the really interesting facts is that for both neuroplasticity and epigenetics, these mechanisms are silent with respect to whether they are wholesome or unwholesome. They can be harnessed for the good. They also can be hijacked to cause suffering. And so a lot of the research on neuroplasticity and on epigenetics has focused on the negative, on suffering. But these very same mechanisms can be harnessed for the good to help promote well-being and human flourishing. And so very briefly, I'd like to talk about 2 other themes. One is our increased understanding of the bidirectional communication between the mind, brain, and the body. Our minds are embodied. And we know that people who report higher levels of well-being are physically healthier. This is a finding which has emerged time and again from large population-based research, from epidemiological studies. Now, it's not true of everyone, but if you look at a large population-based study with tens of thousands of participants, this is what you see. This leads to the conjecture that cultivating well-being doesn't only affect our psychological well-being, our emotional well-being, our subjective well-being, it also influences our body in ways that are consequential for our health. And in turn, we also know that the state of the body modulates the mind and the brain and influences our well-being going in the reverse direction as well. So the final theme that I'll mention is one that probably is the most controversial among these themes, but it is one that is supported by an increasing body of substantial scientific evidence. And this is what I call innate basic goodness. Every human being comes into the world with a predisposition for basic goodness. Now, what does that mean? That means that if we are given the choice, we choose a more pro-social and altruistic alternative. And in some sense, this is not very surprising. You know, all of you come to a seminar on well-being, but I'll bet you very few people would come to a seminar on how to cultivate anger. We have a natural resonance with goodness and well-being. It is a state that intrinsically resonates with us as something that is good, that is kind of fundamentally okay. So what is the kind of evidence that supports this? And how can we make such a statement, particularly in the face of all of the conflict and difficulties that we see today in the world? Well, what this means is that when an infant comes into the world, she or he exhibits this preference. So I'm going to show you now two really short videos, less than a minute. And these videos were shown to 6-month-old babies. I'll show them to you, and then I'll explain what the experiment was really about. But just understand that these were, and they're scenarios that involve puppets playing together, which is sort of age appropriate for these 6-month-old babies. So here's the first one. And now here's the second one. Which of these two videos do you think a 6-month-old baby prefers? Now, I can't see you all, so it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but I'm sure most of you are thinking probably the first, and you are absolutely right. Now, you also should be wondering, how do you know what a 6-month-old baby prefers? Well, there are a number of ways of measuring this. If you notice, the stuffed animals were in different colors. So one of the things that is done is for the puppets, the stuffed animals, to be held in front of the babies to see which it reaches for. Does it reach for the puppet that was helpful, or does it reach for the puppet that was unhelpful? Well, more than 90% of infants reach for the helpful puppet. We can also look to see which scenario is associated with more smiling. Babies smile more at the first one than the second one. They also look more at the first one than the second one. We can track from their eye movements where they're looking and how much they're looking, and they look more at the first one than the second one. So on all of these different measures, it shows that in early life, we show this kind of preference. Now, why is this so interesting and important? When we engage in a practice to cultivate kindness and to cultivate compassion, we're not creating some new state or emotion, but rather we're actually familiarizing ourselves with our basic nature. And in that sense, we think of kindness in the same way that scientists think of language. We all know that we come into the world with a biological propensity for language. That propensity requires that we be raised in a normal linguistic community for it to be expressed. We know that kids who have been raised in the wild, so-called feral children, and there have been some case studies of these kids, they don't develop normal language. And in the same way, we think of kindness as a biological propensity that's there from the start, but it requires nurturing in order for that seed to become expressed. Okay, so I want to just say a few things about the urgent need. Now, I often talked about the urgent need before the pandemic, and that need has only been accentuated by the pandemic. In a survey which was done in the United States just before the pandemic, 76% of adult respondents reported that they felt either moderately or significantly lonely. 76%. We know that over the 5-year period just before the pandemic, the rates of depression in many different parts of the world have been increasing. And in the US, that increase over the 5-year period before the pandemic was more than 30%. And the rates are double in females than they are in males. And this gender difference has been found in every Western country in which this has been examined. And I can say more about that maybe during the question and answer period. There's a recent paper which came out a few weeks ago in the Journal of the American Medical Association, reporting that the rates of depression in the US have more than tripled during the pandemic in certain age groups. We know that distractibility has dramatically increased worldwide. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. There are many different metrics of that. Distractibility is increasing both in our children as well as in adults. The bottom line is that the trajectory that we've been on as a species is not a particularly healthy or sustainable one. And the pandemic has only exacerbated some of those trends. The pandemic has also, I think, reminded us of another or other ways of being, and also other ways of relating to our natural environment, which may result in a recalibration post-pandemic, which, of course, I think we all very much aspire toward, and we can talk more about that later. But there is a sense in which the cultivation of well-being we hold to be an urgent public health need for all of these reasons. One of the considerations which I invite you to reflect on is when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And I'm sure that every one of you who has joined us today brushes your teeth every day, and probably a few times a day. This is not part of our genome. This is something that we've all learned to do. There's something else I think you would all agree with me on, and that is that I think most of people, and I'm sure all the people who are joining us today would agree that their minds are even more important than their teeth. And yet, a very substantial fraction of humanity does not spend even the short amount of time that we spend brushing our teeth nourishing their mind every day. So one of our goals is to change the cultural meme around this idea of well-being as a public health issue, and to spread the word that even a few minutes a day can make a real difference. And in fact, we now have hard-nosed scientific evidence to show that that's true. So let me walk you through some of that now. Actually, before I do, I want to, excuse me, just show you one other quote. This is a quote from a friend of mine, someone that Begonia has also met, who we shared a stage together at the World Economic Forum, I believe in 2014. His name is Tom Insel, and he was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, which is part of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. The National Institute of Mental Health is the largest funding agency for mental health research in the world. It focuses primarily on the biology of mental illness. And Tom Insel was the director of this organization for 13 years. He retired a number of years ago, and just last year he was interviewed. And this is what he said in the interview. He said, "I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realize that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think 20 billion US dollars, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that." And Tom Insel, in the early days of our work with long-term meditation practitioners, was quite skeptical that this work would really lead to anything. And in 2014, when we were together in Davos, we were on a panel discussing the importance of mindfulness. And Tom has come a long way in a relatively short period of time, now recognizing that the kinds of strategies that we're talking about may be even more efficient at changing our brains than drugs. And it's not to say that pharmaceuticals are unimportant or inappropriate. I certainly am not someone who is anti-medication, but I believe that we can do a lot using our own minds to change our own biology, and we need to explore the further reaches of these possibilities. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of the time now on a framework that we have been focusing on in our center and in a lot of the work and dissemination that we do. And it's a framework that's specifically focused on the plasticity of well-being, on how to nurture well-being. And it holds that there are 4 key pillars of well-being that exhibit plasticity that actually can be trained. So what are those 4 pillars? So what I'm going to do now is tell you about each of these 4 pillars, and then talk a little bit about the science in 1 or 2 of them, and then we'll have a pause for some discussion. The first pillar of well-being is awareness. Now, some of you may be a little surprised that awareness is connected to well-being, but I'll show you some evidence soon that makes this very direct link. It turns out that our capacity to focus our attention and our capacity to know what our minds are doing is so important for our well-being, and particularly for nurturing well-being. So this latter capacity, the capacity to know what our minds are doing, some of you may be a little puzzled by that. Psychologists and neuroscientists call that meta-awareness. Now, how many of you have had the experience, and I certainly confess that I've had this experience, of reading a book where you might be reading each word on a page, and you read one page, you may read a second page, and after a few minutes, you realize you have no idea what you've just read. Your mind is somewhere else. It's lost. That is an example of a lapse of meta-awareness. The moment we recognize that our minds are lost, that is a moment of awakening. It's a moment of meta-awareness. And it turns out that that can be trained. And it is a very valuable competence that human beings have. And in fact, we believe that meta-awareness is actually necessary. It's a necessary ingredient for all other forms of enduring transformation. And this is why we put awareness first. So the second pillar is connection. Connection is about the qualities which are important for healthy social relationships. Qualities like appreciation and gratitude and kindness and empathy and compassion. All of those qualities are part of connection. And more research shows that these are qualities that can be trained, and the contemplative traditions that are exemplified in the work that Begonia is doing are great examples of methods that can cultivate these qualities, and particularly awareness and connection, as well as the other two, which I'm about to share. So the third pillar of well-being is insight. And insight is really about getting curious about how our minds actually work. And particularly this quality of our mind that we all share, which is this narrative. We all have a narrative about ourselves that we carry around in our heads. And at the very extreme end of a distribution, there are people who have a very negative narrative. They have negative self-beliefs, and they actually hold those beliefs to be a true description of who they are. And of course, that is a prescription for depression. So one of the key elements of well-being is not so much changing our narrative or fixing it, but rather it is recognizing the narrative for what it is, changing our relationship to the narrative, and seeing that it is a constellation of thoughts and understanding how those thoughts shape our perception of reality. And finally, the last pillar of well-being is purpose. Purpose is about discovering where our lives are headed or directed, and finding the meaning and value in what it is that we're doing. And purpose is not so much deciding that I'm going to now go and find something more purposeful to do, but rather it's discovering the meaning and purpose in the things that we are already doing. So again, it's not about fixing anything. It's not about changing what we're doing. It's really a matter of discovering what is really already there, but buried, perhaps, and strengthening it. Okay, so let's now take a bit of a deeper dive and first go into awareness. And one of my intellectual heroes in Western scholarship is William James. William James was America's first great psychologist, and he wrote a 2-volume tome in 1890 called The Principles of Psychology. And in that book, he has a whole chapter on attention. And I'd like to read you a quote from this chapter. That's William James. And he said, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about." Now, I think if William James had more connection to the contemplative traditions from Buddhism and other Asian traditions, he would have instantaneously seen that if nothing else, these are strategies to educate attention. And we know that attention is the building block for all other forms of learning. And the fact that we don't teach our children skills of attention is nothing short, in my view, of a moral failing, because we know that this underlies everything else. And we know we have some idea, at least, how to do this. And so one of our missions is to extend this work into the education sector so that we can bring strategies to nurture awareness and attention to young children. And if we can intervene at an earlier and earlier age, there will be multiplicative effects as the children develop. So I want to show you one other finding concerning awareness and attention. We're not all together in person, which makes asking questions and getting responses a little bit more challenging. So I'll just ask the question rhetorically. But so here's the question. How much of the time does the average person spend not paying attention to what they're doing? How much time does the average person spend not paying attention to what they're doing? So you can all think of what your answer might be. Now, how do we discover the answer to this? Well, one way is we can take advantage of the fact that virtually everyone these days carries around smartphones, and with people's permission, we can text them at different points during the day. And this is a study that was done now 10 years ago. And they used this method, and they asked people 3 questions. The first question is, what are you doing right now? And they had to check off from a list of activities what they were doing. Second question, where is your mind right now, right at the moment that you're being asked? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? And the third question is, right at this moment, how happy or unhappy are you right now? And they rated it on a sliding scale. So here's what they discovered. They discovered that the average person spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. 47% of the time. And importantly, when they reported that they were not paying attention to what they were doing, they were significantly less happy. The title of this scientific paper is "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." Being distracted, even if what you're doing is boring, even you might be doing the dishes or cleaning your house, if you're distracted, it exacts a toll and you are less happy. So this is the important connection between awareness and well-being. Okay, I'm going to just move ahead and share a little bit about connection, and then finish with a couple of slides, and then we'll have a discussion. Connection is such an important component of well-being, particularly since a larger fraction of people in many countries today are reporting significant loneliness. We know that loneliness is not, again, just an ephemeral subjective state. It turns out that loneliness is greater than a twofold risk factor compared to obesity in mortality. It actually is it accounts for more than 2 times the amount of variance that obesity accounts for in producing premature death. And there's good epidemiological evidence to suggest that. And so loneliness gets under the skin and affects our biology. And it turns out that even during the time of the pandemic, there are things that we can do to nurture connection. One of the unfortunate choices of wording by public health officials, I think, has been this phrase, social distancing. What we are being asked to do is to be physically distanced, not to be socially distanced. We can remain socially connected and still be physically distant. One way to do that is by using appreciation. If we build into our daily routine moments of appreciation, where we bring into our mind and our heart other people who are important to us, who may be helpful to us during the time of this pandemic, we can experience a close social connection to them, even if they're people we may not know well. A person who may deliver important packages or food to your place, medical workers who are risking their own health to help others, whoever it might be. But appreciation is an elixir which can really help to soothe this quality of loneliness. So we know from neuroscientific evidence that it actually doesn't take much to nurture connection. You can get this system going pretty quickly in the brain. Now, it doesn't mean that the effects will last. You need to keep practicing, but you can get them started quite quickly. We've done research showing that after just 2 weeks of practicing a few minutes a day, your brain can actually change. We can show this on an MRI scanner. And again, I don't need to go through the details of all the scientific research, but one of the really cool findings that's very recent that we have not yet published that we're really excited about is a finding that where we worked with teachers. These were actually teachers who were teachers in training. We call them in the US pre-service teachers. They're in their last semester of education school before they go out and become full-time teachers. And we train them in practices to cultivate both awareness and connection. And we measured a number of things. One of the things that we measured is their implicit bias. Now, all of these teachers, if you gave them a questionnaire, which we did, and asked them to rate themselves, to tell us whether they're biased against members of other racial and ethnic groups, they report that they're not biased. However, we can use sensitive behavioral methods. And when we use those methods, virtually all of us are biased. We can't help it. This is something that we have implicitly learned being members of cultures and learning through the media and other cultural artifacts that are constantly, we're constantly bathing in, whether we like it or not. And so one of the things that is so devastating in the United States, and I know it's true in many other countries as well, is we have a huge achievement gap between Black and white students in the United States in academic achievement. And that achievement gap is significantly driven by what educators have called a disciplinary gap, which is the disproportionate administration of harsh and punitive punishment toward members of racial outgroups. And that disciplinary gap is driven by implicit bias. So we reasoned that we can potentially tackle this problem at its roots by widening the in-group. And, you know, when you talk to someone like the Dalai Lama, he'll tell you every human being is the same nature, no difference. Doesn't matter what their color is, doesn't matter what their income level is. We're all the same. And he treats every human being, I've seen him do this, with the same respect, with the same grace, with the same compassion universally. So if we widen the in-group and eventually include virtually everyone, then we can tackle implicit bias at its roots. And in this particular study, we found that these teachers showed a significant reduction in implicit bias compared to a control group who were taught the regular curriculum. And that reduction in implicit bias lasted for at least, we tested them in a 6-month follow-up period, and it lasted for that full 6 months. And this is just an actual graph of those findings. The teachers who were in the training, who received the awareness and compassion training, are in the treatment group. And this is a measure, a behavioral measure of implicit bias. If you are above the line, you're showing an increase in bias. If you're below the line, you show a decrease in bias. The participants who received this intervention were showing a decrease in bias, and that decrease was still present at 6 months follow-up. And this is the longest preservation of a reduction on a hard-nosed behavioral measure of implicit bias that's been reported in the scientific literature. So we're really excited about this, and we believe it has really important implications. So I'm going to now, with your permission, just go to some final slides here at the end. Whoops, I somehow lost. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and just show you a couple of other things. Okay, we believe that through the kind of training that we're talking about, nourishing our mind, we can change the world in really important ways. And in this slide, I want to summarize a whole series of findings, some of which I've mentioned, many of which I haven't, but just to give you a feel for some of the opportunities that I think we have in disseminating these kinds of practices to more sectors in our society. I've shown you that we can reduce implicit bias. We can also increase school achievement. We can potentially reduce healthcare costs. There's a little bit of evidence that suggests this. There's much more that's needed, but based on the conjecture that we can that when we cultivate well-being, we can improve our physical health. We can therefore reduce our healthcare costs. And there's a little bit of evidence for this. We can improve teamwork and collaboration. We can reduce distraction, and we can increase productivity, focus, creativity, and resilience. Who wouldn't want this? So one of the things that we've done is we've put all of this into a very accessible program that we call the Healthy Minds Program. And we've actually created an app that right now, unfortunately, is only available in English, but it is available throughout the world, and it's totally free. It's been designed and produced by our affiliated nonprofit, and so we have released it free to the world. You can learn more about it by going to this website, tryhealthyminds.org. And you can also become a citizen scientist. You can donate your data, which we believe is going to be really helpful, because it may be that we need more precision in how to do this, that not everyone is going to have the same formula, so to speak. And not every strategy is going to work for all people. And we think we can do a better job at matching people to strategies which may be most effective for them in promoting their well-being. But that's going to take very large-scale citizen science work. So this is just a screenshot of some of the features of our app, but you can find out more about it by downloading it. And I want to end with one of my favorite quotes from His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And this is something that he wrote in a book that was on the bestseller list for a while. I'm just trying to read it on my own screen. I apologize. I may not be able to do this successfully. There I go. Okay. He said, the systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenging negative mental states is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable. So thank you all so much. You can learn more about our work by going to our website and other social media. And I'm happy now to answer questions and to maybe we can do a little practice together.
Great. Thank you so much, Richie. That was so rich, so full, so helpful. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite you to, so the audience to pose questions. in order to do that, so for those who speak English, they can actually ask their questions directly on the screen. And in order to do that, you need to raise your hand, which you can then go into the actions button and select the raise your hand. If you don't speak English, then you can ask your question via chat, and one of the hosts, Auntie or myself, will help translate.
Begonia, there's an echo.
There is an echo. Yeah, I agree. I don't know exactly why. Is the echo? Yeah.
I wonder if everyone can mute.
Okay, I think we are okay now, right? Yeah, good. So then we're open for questions. Go to the reactions button and select the raise your hand, and we have Barbara and Lise. Antje, are you managing this, or shall I do it? I will. Okay. So Lise.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just wondering about the practices you did with the student teachers. Was it meta practices that you did with them?
It included meta practices. Yes. There are other compassion practices that also were utilized that are similar to metta practices, but you can certainly think of metta practices as being a core element of this. Yes.
Great. Diara?
Thank you. Actually, my name is Diana. I just didn't spell it right. I was wondering about the wandering of the mind. I found it so curious when you said we are always wandering with our minds. And then I had to think about dreaming or wandering, you know, like daydreaming. And sometimes I feel that is so relaxing. But would you say this is also a way of being attentive, to be in attention, to be consciously wandering, and to be like self-forgotten, wandering in a conscious way?
Yeah. So I really appreciate that question. It's an important question. And there's a lot to say about that. So the title of that paper, as I mentioned, is A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind. And the implication is that a wandering mind is not good for you. And I take it that one of the elements of your question is that sometimes when our minds wander, it could be helpful. Often people ask, well, isn't that a source of a lot of creativity? And so isn't it beneficial that we allow our minds to wander? And so there's a lot to say. And here's the response in a nutshell. We are so pulled by external forces around us. Our attention is so externally oriented most of the time. And because of that, we spend very little time consulting, if you will, our own interior, consulting our own minds. And so my own view, and the scientific research backs this up, is that there's a lot of intrinsic cognitive activity which is occurring in our minds. we are simply not aware of it. And so it's not a central part of our experience. And, you know, it's interesting, people often report having aha moments, like when they're in the shower, they have an insight. Well, why does it happen in the shower and not while you're engaged in a really significant conversation? The reason why it happens in the shower is because the shower is not a cognitively demanding period. And so our minds are able to be looser during that period, so to speak. And so the invitation here is, if we actually paid more attention to what's going on in our mind and develop meta-awareness so that we were monitoring our own minds, even while we're talking. So I right now, as I'm talking to you, I'm also aware of background thoughts that I'm having. And we can do that. We can cultivate this quality of meta-awareness, awareness of the background. And it's kind of like dreams. We know that every normal human being dreams several times a night. We can put you in the sleep lab and wake you after a REM period, and virtually everyone will report a dream then. But when you wake up in the morning, many people, in fact, most people, don't remember their dreams, but you're still dreaming. So this is very much like that. If we paid more attention to what's going on in our mind, we can harness this natural creativity. And we can spend periods simply inspecting our own mind. One of the things that I suggest to my graduate students and postdocs is that they should spend at least a couple of hours a week without any books or journals and simply paying attention to what's going on in their mind. Not directing their mind, but just being aware and having a little pad where they can write down just little snippets to remind them of what they were thinking. And that is a way to cultivate awareness of what's actually happening. So I would say, yes, it is useful for the mind to be in a mode where it is freely associating. But in order for us to harness the benefit from that, we need to be aware of it. And that awareness is something that we can cultivate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have Veronica. Yeah, Veronica.
Yeah, I have two things. Just to add to that, I would say awareness of your body and your body sensations also as a part of this work. But my question is, I am fascinated. This is the first time I've heard a talk bringing it away from this, or science, bringing it away from the individual in the context or in the framing of public health. So I'm really curious as to how far you've been able to go with that. Maybe I don't know about global health, but even in the US, how far you've been able to go with that in terms of the science and even the policy.
Well, I appreciate the question, and you know, it's a process, and I would say that we're at the very early stages, but I think there is some traction. We've been interacting with some people at the World Health Organization who are really interested in this. The United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly the SDG 4. And for those of you who are particularly curious, 4.7, I would encourage you to go and look what 4.7 is. But it has to do with the cultivation of qualities which are important for well-being. And I've been working with various groups at the UN on this, and it's becoming, I think, more mainstream. And in the United States, I'm very pleased to say that just yesterday, the Senate confirmed President Biden's appointment for Surgeon General of the United States. And the Surgeon General is the Chief Public Health Officer for the US. And the 4.7, by the way, this was just asked in the questions, is a United Nations Sustainable Development Goal. So if you Google Sustainable Development Goal 4.7, you will find out. So the Vivek Murthy was just confirmed yesterday as the Surgeon General. He also served as the Surgeon General under President Obama. And I know him quite well, and he's a wonderful person, and he has adopted well-being as an urgent public health need. This will be an important feature of his platform as the Chief Public Health Officer of the United States. And I think that this will help to elevate the status of this kind of work. And he also is a meditator. So wonderful guy. And by the way, he also wrote a book that came out this past year. Whoops, I'm getting an echo. It went away. Okay. A book which came out this past year called Together, and it's a book about the power of social connection in health and illness. And it's a beautiful book that I would highly recommend.
So we have Talita.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. And you were mentioning before that we are all born with the innate goodness. So I wonder how this works together with the idea of reincarnation. Perhaps you could elaborate a bit on this?
You're asking me. Whoops. There's an echo. Now it's gone. You're asking me really easy questions. That's a joke. You know, the Dalai Lama, whenever reincarnation is brought up, says, "Oh, that's Buddhist business," and is very reluctant to talk to scientists about it. So I really can't say very much about reincarnation. It's not anything that has been remotely approached in a serious scientific way. So I can't really speak to that as a scientist. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Sorry, I can't be helpful.
So Barbara, you're on the screen. Hi, Barbara. Nice to see you. You should unmute yourself.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for such a great talk. I was last time when Begonia hosted you at Landguet Ried, I had the pleasure to be there, and I hope we're going to be there soon together.
I hope so too.
Two questions. One is in fact linked to what Veronica mentioned. You know, it really struck me that World Health Organization, even in the definition of well-being, from the Constitution in 1946, they define health is a state of complete physical, mental, social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Yet it really strikes me that so little has been, I would say, learned or taken into policies and guidance from the science that is there. And I'm just curious why this process has been so slow where there is so much science and evidence today that could be brought into policies. That's first question. And the second, if I may, it really struck me what you said at the beginning, which is you mentioned intergenerational awakening. It's first time that I ever heard this expression. You hear again and again intergenerational trauma, especially now, of all kinds of trauma, but this beauty of intergenerational awakening really struck me today. And I'm really curious both on evidence, but also on, I certainly think and feel it's happening now, but I'm surprised that there is so little discussion about it. And I wonder what kind of evidence or what kind of narratives can we use to bring this more, to make people more aware that this is something that is there and there is some evidence and this is happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate the questions. So let me take them in order. The first question is related to the World Health Organization definition of health. And I really appreciate you bringing that up. It is such a beautiful definition of health and my favorite one. And unfortunately, as you indicate, it's not a definition that has been commonly adopted. So, in the US, we have the National Institutes of Health, and I kid people, but, it's really quite serious that it's a complete misnomer. It really should be called the National Institutes of Disease, because it's not really about health, it's about illness. Now, there is a reason why, we do need more research and better treatments for illnesses. That's clear and very important. In addition, we need a focus on health, and that's something that's been missing. And so, I've been doing everything that I can as a scientist, using the whatever moral authority I may have to help promote this idea. And I do think it's beginning to slowly catch on. In the US today, the National Institutes of Health just launched an initiative on emotional well-being. And I've been very much a part of that, and I've been agitating for them to do that for about 5 years. And finally, they've actually put some dollars to that for the first time. A minuscule commitment, but nevertheless, it's the way things begin. So I'm pleased to see that. The second question you asked is about this idea which I'm floating about the intergenerational transmission of awakening. This is a phrase that I've never heard before. I made it up, but I really do believe that it occurs in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that Begonia comes from, and that I also am a student of. We know that there are individuals who are born and are considered, who are born into families where there are great meditators, and where both of their parents are great meditators. There's a specific word, they're considered tulkus, which means that they have some unusual spiritual qualities. And those are recognized very early on. That is the intergenerational transmission of awakening, I would say. And scientifically, we are beginning to learn about those mechanisms. So we have been doing some basic research in the laboratory with pregnant women. And we study features of their well-being, and we're doing work now where we're actually training them on methods to cultivate awareness, connection, insight, and purpose to train their well-being, and looking at the impact not so much on the moms, but on their babies. And so we identify them at the beginning of their pregnancy and follow them as they go through the pregnancy and then give birth. And one of the things that we're able to do is in the umbilical cord, there is blood, and the umbilical cord is typically tossed away, and it actually contains the blood of the fetus. And from that, we can take a blood sample and actually get an epigenetic snapshot of the fetus at the time that the baby is born. And then once they're born, we put the babies in the MRI scanner. That may sound strange, but the MRI scanner is really totally safe. And they're sleeping most of the time. So it's actually very easy to scan them. And so we've been scanning the babies and looking at exactly this question. And so there are already data that we've published on this and more to come, but this is one way that we can begin to seriously study these questions scientifically.
Matthias, yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Richard. I have two questions. I'm a teacher and I would like to know what could I do with my students, like a sort of short practice to help with their mental health. And the second one is, since the epidemic, but even before, at school, we get iPads for our students. And almost every student has an iPad today, and many teachers say that makes the situation we have even worse, makes them even more distractible. So what are your thoughts about getting all the kids iPads? That's what's happening right now at my school and at many other schools.
Yeah, so on that point, first of all, I appreciate the question. That's clearly happening in many parts of the world today as a consequence of the pandemic. And it's a serious problem. And our children are being entered into an experiment for which none of us have given our consent, because it's this is the state of the world today. And I certainly share your concerns. And there's, in fact, very good evidence to suggest that even before the pandemic, kids today are more distracted than they were 50 years ago, before the advent of the internet and before these digital devices became available. But we're not going to get rid of the iPad. We're not going to get rid of this technology. And so it's our responsibility to figure out how to educate the kids so that they can use the technology in ways that are beneficial, but also not get hijacked by the technology in ways that cause suffering. And I believe it's possible. I believe we can educate children to do that. At least in the US today, the average person checks their phone 200 times a day. Now, that's just not necessary. We can all get by and function perfectly well without checking our phone 200 times a day. But it will take some training to do that, because the technology companies have become masters at how to capture our attention. And so we need to train ourselves and our children in these skills, which can enable them to resist these distractions and be able to use the technology when they want in ways that are beneficial. So that's the issue with technology. In terms of your other question concerning what can you do with your students, part of it depends on which ages your students are, how old they are. But there are resources available. If you go to our website, you can find lots of resources relating to methods for children beginning as young as preschool children and up through there that you can explore in the classroom. But let me also say that we know from hard-nosed research that the most important thing you can do for your kids is for you to embody these characteristics in yourself. That's the most important.
Okay, so I'm going to translate a couple of questions that have been posted in Spanish through the chat. So one of them is from Guillermo Valenzuela, and maybe we can put him on the screen. So many people resist the idea that goodness is innate in people, and they usually give like all the opposite examples of evil in the world. So what do you think is the best way to convince people about this innate goodness? This is the first question from Guillermo.
Yeah, I really think that this is such an important question and an important issue. And I wish I knew what the best strategy was. I don't really know. There are a few things to say. One is that if you look at very young infants, you'll never see an infant who prefers evil over good. Just doesn't happen. So there is compelling evidence from science early on in life that shows that we come into the world with this kind of predisposition. Kindness feels better than evil. We prefer to be around people who are kind to us compared to people who are mean to us. It doesn't take that much imagination to have a person just reflect on who they enjoy being with. They don't enjoy being with people who are mean to them, who hurt them. That's just not our nature. We're not drawn to people who are evil toward us. We're drawn to people who are kind toward us. And so, I think that sometimes people can get so locked into a particular frame of mind and worldview that they lose their connection to themselves. And so I think that having strategies to help people reconnect to themselves in this way is really important.
Thank you. So
thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so a second question from Celaya. What opinion do you have about quantum physics and the mind? Is there also a relationship with neuroplasticity?
I may disappoint you in this answer. Francisco Varela was a great neuroscientist who was a dear friend and colleague and one of the co-founders of the Mind and Life Institute. He was a Chilean neuroscientist, born in Chile, and then worked for most of his life in France, in Paris. And he was one of the founders of contemplative neuroscience. And in the early dialogues with the Dalai Lama, one of the things Francisco said is that while there are some great insights that we can learn from physics about how the world works, it's never going to be relevant to how the mind works. It just is at the wrong level of analysis for that. And the insights about the mind from science are going to come from neuroscience, not from quantum physics. Now, I don't know enough, honestly, about quantum physics. I have many friends who are physicists, and I love to spend time with them to learn what the latest findings are and theories. And I try to do that on a regular basis. But I've never seen a really granular connection between quantum physics and our understanding of the mind. The connections that I've seen are at the level of metaphor, not at the level of real scientific granularity.
Okay, so have George.
And maybe one more question, and then I'm going to have to.
Yeah, I was going to say it's.
Okay. So hi Richie, good to see you again. We met 3 years ago as well at Landguet Ried, and thank you again for all your insight that you're sharing. My question is actually very brief. Maybe it's more a personal question. You said that the meta-awareness is the knowing what the mind is doing, and now with all this science and the insights in neuroscience, what's your opinion? If meta-awareness, seeing it as the knowing what the brain and the nervous system is doing, we have all this knowledge right now, like many people have access to this. Can this also contribute to well-being as such?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So one of the insights that we've learned from neuroscience is that there are two fundamentally different kinds of learning. One kind of learning we call declarative learning, which is learning about stuff, conceptual. The other form of learning we call procedural learning. Procedural learning is skill-based. It is acquired through practice, and it is represented in completely different brain systems compared to declarative learning. And from everything we can glean, in order for true transformation to occur, we need both. We need both declarative learning and procedural learning. I think knowledge of neuroscience might be helpful and probably is helpful in the declarative learning to help us really appreciate a certain kind of view, which happens to be a view that some of the ancient contemplative traditions also have. So I think this could be very helpful, but by itself, it is insufficient. So no amount of neuroscience will really be enough to produce genuine transformation because it's missing the procedural piece. So we need that procedural piece to accompany the declarative piece to produce real change.
Thank you, Richie. We have 2 more questions, but I think it's 8 o'clock. It's 1.5 hours, and probably you're tired. Translators are tired. It's your call, Richie.
How about we split it and I take one?
Okay. So, Seren is the lucky winner. You can go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for the interesting presentation today. My question is related to neuroplasticity and epigenetic change. So do you think teaching these 4 pillars to children who experienced early life stress could help them actually reverse these epigenetic modifications? So if they are having some maladaptive reactions due to these epigenetic changes, do you think this can be altered through teaching them these 4 pillars? And
yeah, it's a great question, and the honest answer is that at this point in time we don't know. But I believe that we have a moral obligation to try, because these children are really suffering, and we know that exposure to adversity early in life can have multiplicative effects as the children develop. and things get worse from there. So one of the things that we also know is that these are really safe kinds of interventions. It's not like giving kids drugs, which have more serious side effects. So we need to try, and we're only going to learn by trying. So I think we really need to embrace this possibility and do everything we can to try. And I think there may well be a possibility. And that gives me a lot of hope and optimism for the future.
So I guess this is the end of this wonderful talk. Really, thank you so much, Richie. It has been so insightful, so full of interesting information and so helpful. Thank you to all of you for all the interesting questions as well. I think we would all like to continue for 1 more hour at least, but yeah, so I also want to thank you, Richie, for the wonderful work that you're doing for this world. I think the work that you're doing is essential, and to advance, to make, you know, the goodness of the world advance, and so that people can really realize that this is something that we can work on. It's essential work, and I really thank you for that. For Center for Healthy Minds, that everything that you are doing there. I would like to thank the translators. We have had wonderful translators working with us tonight. Geneviève, Rinchen, and Natalie. Just to say hi. So
thank you all. You guys wonderful, really appreciate it. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Begonia, and all that you are doing to bring this work to the world, and the public service that you are engaged in, which I think is so important, and your courage in taking this on as a central life mission. I so deeply resonate with and appreciate. And I very much look forward to the time when we can all be traveling again. And I miss giving you a hug. So please feel my virtual hug. And it was great to be with all of you. And I'm happy to come back again for more if there is interest. So
there is certainly interest, and we are very much looking forward to being able to travel again, and we will certainly be in touch with you, Richie, for more. And we are really looking forward to seeing everyone here at Landguet Ried again. It's a little bit sad to be, you know, in this kind of lockdown, but at least, you know, technology has a good side that enables us to be together, at least for these virtual meetings. And again, yeah, in that, Richie, we are kind of kindred spirits in trying to bring that mission into the world. And that was our little joke when we used to meet at the World Economic Forum. Like, we found we were in the little mission to bring these to, you know, where it really also mattered to, you know, influential people that could actually make a difference in the world through learning the goodness of meditation. So I'm just so happy to have met you, Richie, and for our friendship. Thank you.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.